I am Margot Hannigan. I'm a Kiwi. I was born in Auckland, but I've lived in Nelson for the past 40 years, and Nelson's become my home. I love the landscape, the river, and especially the music. It's a unique town in New Zealand because it's always had an independent school of music, not a state-owned one, not a copy of anything elsewhere. It was started by a German, and he crossed the world to make this a musical town with that very beautiful building which has a fantastic acoustic. And it's small, but it's like a little oasis in Nelson because it draws people of all ages in there to listen to music and to play music together. If I were describing what's unique about the Nelson Symphony Orchestra, I would say that it's a group of extraordinary people who are some amateurs and some professionals, but they manage to share their love of music and their talents. So there's no ego. It's all a group of musicians listening to one another. And it's quite a unique experience. I joined when I was 37, and so I've been with them for 34 years. And I started as an adult. And at the time, the Nelson School of Music was being run by a man called Donald Maurice, who's now in Wellington, and he's been all over the world playing the viola d'amore, which he is a unique specialist in. But he came here for 3 years as the director of the School of Music, full of enthusiasm. He plays viola, and I went into the School of Music the first year I came to Nelson and said, "Is there a violin teacher that you would recommend?" He said, "Well, they're all taken by this time of year, but I'll take you on." And he did. And I'd never played the violin. I'd never thought of doing any exams or anything. In fact, the thought of doing exams scared me to death. But he said, "Have you ever thought of being in an orchestra?" And I said, "Oh, one day it would be a real dream." He said, "Well, next week we're auditioning everybody. We're revamping the Nelson Symphony Orchestra, and we're going to start with auditions and then select people again, so that it's not going to be any old orchestra. It's going to lift its standards because we're going to try and have the auditions properly done." So he said, "Why don't you come along and play your Corelli to me and my friend who's going to be the conductor of the orchestra?" And this was a man called Richard Harris, who's a violinist. And I was very nervous and played in the audition, and at the end of it, it was a short piece by Corelli. Donald Maurice said, Did you realise that you were a bit out of tune there?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I did. I'm sorry." And they both looked at one another and laughed, and they said, "I think we could fit you in the back row of the second violins, and you can sit next to Steve Shaw, and he's been around for years. He'll help you." So I was astounded that they'd have me, knowing that I was a bit out of tune. But of course, once you're playing in the orchestra, you don't hear any mistakes you make. You hear everybody else's music all around you, and you feel part of it. So it was a very encouraging step. And Richard Harris is still playing the violin. He's in his 80s. And Donald Maurice is, as I said, he's moved to Wellington, but he's playing viola d'amore, and he often comes back. There seems to be a sort of a loyalty from people who've played music together. You get to play such repertoire. Pieces, we've played so many wonderful composers. We've played Tchaikovsky, we've played Shostakovich, we've played Mozart so many times, and we've played Beethoven. And then we also we've been allowed to invite guest soloists, and that's pretty special. It's absolutely marvellous to play with someone who's come from elsewhere. We had Italians come, Matteo Napoli, and we've had the best of New Zealand musicians really come because they enjoy playing with a community orchestra, and they love the acoustic at the NCMA. But they feel a communication that you don't get in any other way. When you've played music with people, you're bonded in a very sort of spiritual way, really, because music's always soulful. It's always part of your emotional well-being. And to share that is just so special. Well, I was 37 when I started in Nelson. I'd learnt for a year at school, and my family had made me go and practice in the basement. And it really was, I wasn't supported in my love of the violin really by my siblings, but I always found the violin as close as any instrument to the human voice, because when you're playing the violin, you're really singing. You're singing in your heart and producing a vibration that is so like the human voice. And it has such an incredible range of feeling and emotion. So I always felt too that I never mastered the violin. You can never feel totally satisfied because it extends you all the time. It's such an incredibly delicate making of the notes. So just a very slight movement of one finger can make it sound awfully out of tune. And yet, if you get it in tune, it has a heavenly quality about it. And it took me years to develop a good vibrato, because a vibrato is making the violin sound even more like the human voice, because all of us, when we speak, have a little quiver that's quite a unique sort of self-expression, really, with the way you talk and the way you sing. But the vibrato is always very individual too. So some people like a wider vibrato so that they have more of a sort of intense quiver in their music. But that's also magic to listen to listen to everyone's different expression on the violin with the vibrato. But now, of course, I'm getting too much vibrato. I couldn't get started and now I can't stop. So I knew when I couldn't control my vibrato sufficiently that it was time to pull out and finish and just start listening to music instead of playing it in an unsatisfying and frustrating way. So these days I can't really play my violin with any real satisfaction, but I can still listen to the Nelson Symphony Orchestra and understand what joy they're getting from expressing themselves and playing together. And if I hadn't been playing in the orchestra myself for 34 years, I couldn't get as much pleasure as I do now, just listening. Music's solace, I think I'd say. Music lifts my heart. Music gives me joy. But it's also solace because we all have sorrows and memories that only music can only music can improve the emotion, can lift you out of that feeling of grief. Because many composers put quite a lot of grief into the music, and to share that is humanity, the best part of humanity. When you think about the East-West Orchestra that Daniel Barenboim conducts in Israel and Palestine, it's a mixture of both nationalities who are ignoring the conflicts in the Middle East and just sharing the sheer beauty and joy and solace of music. And that can change the world, I believe. It's like Yo-Yo Ma, who set out to have an international group of cellists playing the Silk Road, what he called the Silk Road, which was combining people of totally different political backgrounds, just playing music, and playing music with all their hearts. So they couldn't be enemies anymore. They had to be sharing. And that's the power of music, really. And it does have emotional power like nothing else. And if you think of orchestral music, it's classical music, but it's not classical music for snob value. It's classical music for eternal value. It's been around for centuries, and yet it's still heartfelt, and it links you with previous generations, other cultures, human beings. And I think that's the power of music.